Okay, we'll make a start now with a quorum. Members can remind you that this meeting will be recorded. I ask you to turn off your mobile phones and any tablets also can interfere, and tablet devices should be switched to mute. Remind members to declare their interest as appropriate throughout the meeting. Can I declare the meeting open to the public? Have we any apologies? I have one from Tom Buchanan. A funeral today, and it would have been later. Agenda item 2, chairperson's business. Can I remind the committee that some members undertook a fact-finding visit to Scotland on the 22nd, 23rd of October. Note of that visit is being prepared and will be provided at the meeting next week. And I refer members to the note of the informal meeting held last week with ANI Retail Consortium, pages 5 and 6. Are members content to note?
Great.
And I advise members that the publication of members' attendance at committee meetings will be placed on the website on Friday the 7th of November 2014. Agenda item 3, minutes of the meeting of October the 21st, 2014. Can I refer members to the draft minutes of the meeting on the 21st of October 2014 at pages 8 to 12. Are members content that the draft minutes are accurate?
Great.
Okay. Sign those minutes. Okay. Agenda item 4, matters arising. Can I refer members to the matters arising at pages 13 to 122. Members content to action matters arising as suggested on the index sheet on pages 14 and 15. Okay. Agenda item 5. You're now going to have an oral briefing from Rural Community Network, Anti-Poverty and Social Inclusion. Can I refer members to the memo from the clerk at page 124, the briefing paper from Rural Community Network, which is at page 127. Can I welcome Kate Clifford, Director, and Mr. Aidan Campbell, Policy and Public Affairs Officer of the Rural Community Network. You're very welcome. Can I ask you to take up to 10 minutes to give your presentation, and then be followed by questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much. Say first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come. It's very important for us to be able to be here today to present some of the findings of the work that we've done and some of our opinions in regard to the work that has been ongoing with DARD and the TRIPSI initiative. You have a briefing in the pack, so I'll not go through the background, but Rural Community Network as an organisation has been in existence for 21 years, and our core businesses are around tackling poverty and rural deprivation and disadvantage. In terms of the TRIPSI programme, we really welcome the fact that DARD is running the programme as it puts a focus on issues of rural poverty and social isolation, which, as I say, are core to the business of RCN. The programme has rolled out innovative projects delivered in partnership with rural stakeholders. Tackling poverty and social isolation has sought innovative and creative ways to address issues which are ongoing in rural areas, and it has supported community development infrastructure in rural areas as well. This is built upon the investment which DARD has made in rural community development over the last 20 odd years. RCN believes that the challenge remains that other government departments are not taking rural poverty and social isolation into account to the degree that they should in their service delivery. There's an opportunity to support other departments in their rural delivery through the Rural White Paper Action Plan and Rural Proofing Agendas. TRIPSI provides practical examples of what can be achieved when programmes are both flexible and are delivered in partnership. MARA, we know, has released previously unclaimed money which benefits the wider economy of Northern Ireland and specifically the rural economy. Community Development Funding and the Rural Challenge Fund have secured resources to support and advise individuals and communities. They have supported and sustained communities through community development, and they have helped those seeking health services to access the right support in the right ways. Both the Assisted Rural Transport Scheme and the Contacting Elderly Rural Isolation Project have reduced isolation and kept people well in their own homes. The joined-up nature of this work across departments and across sectors has been very positive. A better understanding of the extent and dynamics of rural poverty and rural deprivation is needed if it is to be tackled. Deprived rural households are often scattered throughout relatively affluent rural areas, and therefore it's harder to identify using the multiple deprivation measure. NISRA need to reconsider now how rural deprivation can be better captured in the multiple deprivation measures, and we're going to come back to that issue at the end of this presentation. The successes and otherwise of TRIPSI that we wanted to talk about, you'll be aware of the detail you have as you have the brief. But we believe the Department should consider how it can best use the data that TRIPSI has generated. MARA has visited 14,000 households across rural Northern Ireland. This is a massive data source and could provide really valuable insights into rural poverty and deprivation. And we believe that it could also be used to inform another round of TRIPSI or the Lifetime Opportunities or any other government programme. Rural areas require a flexible approach to service delivery with a focus on outreach and partnership with grassroots organisations. TRIPSI has demonstrated that this approach can work and can deliver concrete results. Other departments need to learn from this approach so that their services can be delivered in a way that better meets the needs of rural households. It's this partnership approach in delivering TRIPSI that has been a welcome feature. DARD has been very open to developing new partnerships and new approaches. A wide range of partner organisations have been involved in TRIPSI, and DARD have been particularly good at utilising the expertise and knowledge of rural stakeholder organisations. What we believe is that it has been more challenging to build relationships across government departments. While the TRIPSI initiative is welcome, there is a risk that other departments will see rural poverty and social isolation as solely a DARD responsibility. The Learning from TRIPSI programme has huge implications for the works of other departments, but there's a strong argument that they're not making the most of this potential learning. As an organisation, we know low pay is an issue in rural communities, and coupled with rising and living costs, this has led to even tighter household incomes. Is there anything that a further TRIPSI initiative could do to address this issue beyond maximising the uptake of tax credits through a MARA-type scheme? We know the impact of welfare reform in rural communities is completely unknown at this stage until the legislation is agreed and implemented, but it could mean that households which are already targeted by MARA could benefit from a follow-up visit. Public spending will be even tighter in the next budget period, so any successor to TRIPSI will have to be very well targeted to stand any chance of gaining executive approval. And clearly any future TRIPSI programme and initiatives under the Rural Development Programme Priority 6 should complement each other but not duplicate. We believe that if MARA runs for a third time, it may be harder to identify participants. At this stage, many low-income households in the most deprived rural communities have received an enabler visit in the past 3 years. If the programme moves to the next most disadvantaged rural areas to target poor households in those areas, they may become harder to identify. We believe there is no easy solution to this problem, but it may require greater effort to target those households. I'm going to hand over to Aidan now, who's going to talk to you about the multiple deprivation measures.
Thanks, members, and apologies for coughing, but I have a bit of a sore throat, so hopefully I'll not smite anyone, hopefully not. In terms of the measurement then and usage of rural deprivation, which is in the terms of reference for the inquiry, we explored this issue in depth at a Carnegie Challenge debate here in this building up in November 2013, and it was sponsored by some of the MLAs from the committee here and some former MLAs from the committee. Unlike urban areas, which are socially segregated, we would say that deprivation in rural areas exists amongst relative affluence. So that presents a challenge for policymakers, as area-based interventions that can work well in urban areas where that deprivation is spatially concentrated will not necessarily work as well in a rural area where poor people live alongside people who are relatively affluent. So in terms of evidence of that, I mean, if you look at the DSD Family Resources Survey Urban Rural Report carried out in 2011-12, they identified that 24% of individuals living in rural areas were considered to be in relative poverty before housing costs in 2011. So individuals living in a household with a net disposable income below 60% of the UK median income are considered to be in relative poverty. So in terms of the numbers of people in relative poverty in rural Northern Ireland, that's 155,500 people roughly considered to be in relative poverty. By contrast, no rural wards fall within the top 10% of the most deprived wards in Northern Ireland as defined by the multiple deprivation measure. And even if you examine it at the smaller geography of census output area level, which NISRA recommend for rural deprivation, there's only 15 rural output areas that fall within that top 10% of the most deprived. And the output areas have a rough population of about 1,000 to 1,500 people. So there's a big mismatch there in terms of those two data sets. So in terms of options, the To address this issue, you can either change how departments use the multiple deprivation measure and ensure they think more carefully about how they target deprived rural households. And in fairness, Mara has done this by using the multiple deprivation measure firstly to target the most deprived rural wards, and then augmenting that with local knowledge from grassroots community organisations to target individual households. Or secondly, you can change how the multiple deprivation measure captures rural deprivation. This isn't exclusively a Northern Ireland issue, and rural stakeholder groups in England, Scotland and Wales have also raised it in their jurisdictions. Analysis of the index of multiple deprivation in England by ACRE, which is a sister organisation of ours in England, Action for Communities in Rural England, identified only 2% of the most deprived areas are rural, but that 18% of those living below the poverty line live in rural areas. And we included a few links to work in the ACRE's website. It's also been an issue in Wales. The Welsh Local Government Association Rural Forum has presented a report on that, and there's links there if members want to follow up on that. At our Carnegie Challenge debate last year, we heard from Troots Haas, who spoke about the methodology his team had developed to measure area-based deprivation in the Republic of Ireland, which we believe takes better account of rural deprivation. Their method recognises the experience of deprivation in rural communities is profoundly influenced by location and the opportunities that people can or cannot access due to their location and mobility. They define this as opportunity deprivation. And their model includes indicators that quantify the demographic decline that opportunity deprivation leads to. The indicators they use are the proportion of the dependent population, those over 65 and under 16 in any ward, and also the percentage of the adult population in those wards with low levels of educational attainment. And those are used as proxies for rural deprivation in their model. We believe NISRA should consider how these issues can be addressed within the multiple deprivation measure. We know that NISRA is due to conduct a review of the measure in the next few years, and when NISRA refreshed the multiple deprivation measure in 2010, they produced a report with recommendations for future research. One of those recommendations recommended that further research should be undertaken into the identification of rural deprivation, specifically the suitability of indicators employed and the geographical areas used. The ARD Committee could scrutinise how NISRA planned to action this recommendation so that any changes to the measure can ensure rural deprivation is captured. RCN would also recommend NISRA reissues guidance to policymakers on the use of multiple deprivation measure for the allocation of resources and also its limitations in identifying deprived households in rural areas. We believe a better evidence base will inform DARD and other departments and should lead to more effective policy interventions. A better understanding of the dynamics of rural poverty and deprivation should be of interest to all these departments and should inform rural proofing.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. On page 2 of your written briefing, you refer to the data that TRPSI has generated, particularly via the MAR project. Mention that the opportunity to use the data appears to not have been used. Can you expand on this? What should be done with the data and what use could it be?
Well, it's maybe not that the data hasn't been used, but it's just that it exists. And we think it's a great potential in terms of trying to identify where poverty and deprivation is located in rural communities, what the issues are in relation to fuel poverty in terms of benefit, what the issues are in terms of benefit uptake.
Okay.
It potentially could show you where people have received a MARA visit and then didn't maybe go on ahead to make the contact with the advice agencies in those areas. So it could start to maybe pinpoint where issues of pride and sort of people in rural communities who are self-reliant and maybe don't feel they want to come forward to claim their entitlements. So it could start to identify groups of people or demographics, age groups, communities where that reluctance exists, and that could be a useful sort of indicator of where future efforts could go. So we think it's a great resource, and potentially could be a great resource. Certainly it sits within the Public Health Agency, and there is a wealth, I imagine, we don't know obviously because the final evaluation hasn't been completed, but I'd imagine that there should be within that data some really useful indicators in terms of where the dynamics behind rural deprivation and some potentially indicators as to what you should be doing in any successor programmes.
Yeah, I see that like the 14,000 household visits. So
Massive sample.
Massive sample.
Yeah.
The information that you provide on the success of the Mara project is interesting too. Like, you know that the social return on investment in the first phase was that for every £1 invested, over £8 was returned. It's the first time I've actually heard this. How do you come to that conclusion? Could you give us more details on that?
That one came from the first evaluation. I'm not sure which. I think was it Deloitte carried that out.
Right.
I'm not sure which company. It was a consultancy company carried it out, but we can certainly send forward the link to the committee. Maybe should have included that as a reference in the briefing.
Okay, that's okay. Joanne's first person.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank you for your briefing? A couple of points from your briefing. What more do you think the department should be doing to help reach out to those who experience real rural poverty? And I know a lot of these people often fail to come across the radar on various projects, and Kate, you spoke about that in your presentation, that people that are hard to identify, because you've both raised concerns about multiple deprivation measures and its limitations in identifying those deprived households. Have you made these concerns directly to NISRA? And noted as well, you talked about government departments getting a better understanding of the dynamics of rural poverty. Surely for yourselves it's worrying that despite all these statistics, they don't seem to have got a total grip with it. And what improvements would you yourselves like to see in the data going forward?
I think to answer your second question first, I think there's a real need for the rural proofing agenda to be pushed very hard at the moment. I think there's a need for government departments to understand that there needs to be more flexibility in the way that programmes are rolled out and programmes are delivered, and we've seen some really good examples of where that has happened. We've seen, the Western Trust in particular has done phenomenal work in terms of there's a lack of services or outreach services they identified within their area, and they've allowed things like ambulatory clinics. They've linked up with transport links to encourage people, to support people to get to hospital and get to hospital appointments, and we worked on a project with older people that would enable that to happen. So I think there are examples of really good practice out there, and it's about encouraging departments to see that the flexibility and partnership are ways in which rural disadvantage can be addressed, and services shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. What will work in an urban environment won't work in an urban environment. Can I ask you to repeat your first part?
The first one was about those that disappear below the radar, that we're not reaching out to, that we're not getting to know about. And I think you indicate about sometimes people are maybe reticent to come forward. So how do you reach those people that essentially are sometimes in the greatest need?
We have seen that the Mara project in particular has done that. They've used local enablers and local resource, so that there's been a target at disadvantaged areas, and then that's been augmented by local knowledge and local information and joined up service approach. So where an OT is going out to someone who's had a fall and realises that that person maybe is in difficulty, connecting them in with a food programme or connecting them in with a support service locally. The Mara results, we think there's a wealth of information that could be gleaned from that to look at why there is a low uptake of benefit, why people aren't coming forward, why they don't understand what support is available to them in their local constituencies. And I think there's a joined up approach. There are lessons to be learned from what has happened and what's been rolled out that could be brought to other government departments to support what they're doing. I suppose practical examples, we know that there's underemployment, we know that there's intermittent employment in rural areas, so people who are unemployed for 6 weeks more likely are not going to make their way into town to sign on. They know that there's employment round the corner, so they'll work without a benefit for maybe 6 or 8 weeks. We know that there's a low uptake of free school meals in some areas because people have intermittent, low paid or seasonal employment. And this all impacts on benefit and uptake within rural areas. And we think, if we work through Mara and find out what those barriers are, things like the ad campaign that's been happening for older people about checking your benefits, ad campaigns like that could work in rural areas as well and support people to understand what they're entitled to, how they make them and how they make those entitlements.
Another practical maybe example as well, like anecdotally we think that people in rural communities who own assets, people who are still relatively resource poor but maybe asset rich, who have small farms but have low incomes, often see that asset as a bar to any sort of benefit entitlement. It's not necessarily a bar to all benefit entitlements, some of them it might be. But there may be an opportunity there to work through farmers' organisations, the likes of UFU and NIAPA, even to agents, people that agricultural consultants who are supporting farmers to fill in single farm payments. There could be maybe some way of thinking around how they could get the message out to people who do have those assets but maybe have other entitlements there that could boost the sort of low income and keep those people involved in agriculture in a part-time basis. So that could be another sort of practical example that any future programme could consider.
You're quite right. I'm particularly concerned about the older people, and I know that you talk about rolling out your innovative projects, and we know, as you have alluded to, Aidan, that tackling rural poverty and isolation isn't unique to Northern Ireland. You spoke about England and Wales and their examples as well. And as you said, Kate, often these issues are cross-cutting between departments. And I know personally people that have gained quite a lot, particularly elderly people, for going to evening classes and further educational colleges as well. So can I just finally ask you, given that this is going to be squeezed under the current budget, is there an opening, do you think, for greater cooperation between maybe DARD and the colleges to maintain? For many, they see this as a rural lifeline. They're going to their computer class, they're going to their classes in the evening, and for some of them that's the only interaction with other people they get, particularly elderly people, and that's an important lifeline for them. So would you like to see greater cooperation between departments to maintain that with the current budget being squeezed as well, because it's so important for them to avail of that service?
I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 20 years in rural development is that local rural communities have become very resilient, and they do look to join up services. So you have a community education college providing education to young people who are not in employment or training, but also supplying courses to elderly people.
Computer courses or
people in the University of the Third Age. We've seen the growth of that in so many areas. I think that the big thing for us is the connectivity of services. I recently did a piece of work for Dale, and I was in Fermanagh, and the centre that people went to in order to access education, to reskill them, also provided debt advice, also provided advice on what volunteering opportunities were available locally. They provided advice on free services in the community that people could avail of, recreational. They connected into programmes for young people and managing teenagers. So people weren't just getting a service around getting back into their education or getting back into new employment, but they were also getting a holistic connectivity into the community and voluntary sector in that area. And I think that's where, under the squeeze in budgets, we're at risk of losing the community development infrastructure that has built over time, and those connections right across, that if as resources get squeezed, services get squeezed, and those connections get lost.
Well, have you engaged with FE colleges to find out the effectiveness of these courses? Because I know from constituents that have contacted me, they have gained immensely with those. As you said, they're all encompassing. It's without those, with the squeeze being on, without those services, and some of them are doing computer classes and that they never even would have thought of, and that's enabling them to go out, to engage, and even to their basic skills are being maintained. Have you engaged with FE colleges?
No.
That might be something, given the fact that they are under pressure and squeezed as well, to see what more can be done cross-department with DARD as well.
We've pushed very hard the lifelong learning agenda, and we have a skills and education officer within our own organisation, and many of the organisations that we work with, we would be brokering in education and training services specifically around community development, and computer skills and access to basic skills for people. But no, we haven't connected with FE colleges. That's something we think about.
I completely accept your point. I mean, I know even from my own mother, like who's 80, like
gain immensely from it.
Local classes, like in terms of just that contact, getting out of the house and getting on the bus a couple of mornings a week and getting up to a local town for that sort of interaction, social interaction,
It's
my mother's
invaluable,
80,
it
like,
is.
so obviously there's no
Yeah.
employability aspect, but those leisure courses can be very important for older people. But as you rightly say, we know Dell are going to have to face a big budget cut, so I suppose, and they are focused on the employability agenda.
But that
So-
leads into the rural isolation of the department as well,
Absolutely.
so the two.
And there's a cost. I mean, that if we can, keep those older people who are on low incomes in their homes and well for longer, potentially we can say that's offsetting health spending in the long term.
Yeah.
Now, that's a difficult argument to make, when departments have to cut budgets, but
Particularly around rural isolation, I think it's very, very
Yeah.
important that's
Absolutely.
maintained. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Chair.
Joe Byrne.
Thanks, Chairman, and again, thanks for the presentation. Congratulate the Rural Community Network on 20 years of service to rural communities. In relation to cooperation between departments, how do you think can that be achieved in order to address rural proofing issues, and in particular tackling rural poverty?
We believe that it's the remit of every government department to understand rural and to understand why there's a differential for rural services. We've looked at partners in England, Scotland and Wales, and we've looked at how departments are beginning to take account of the rural differential. And I think for us, it's about saying to departments that rural proofing isn't a tick box exercise, but it's about saying how can you deliver good services with good quality and best value in rural areas that meet the needs of rural dwellers. That's the bottom line for us. That's what we'd like to see. So I think the rural proofing agenda and the Rural White Paper Action Plan, which was developed a number of years ago, we've been very strong in lobbying departments to say it's not the one size fits all. We need to take account of the rural differential. I always go back to the example of the health visitor that I worked with a long time ago in Draperstown, and she said when she was a health visitor in Belfast, she could do 8 visits in a day to young mums. But when she was in Draperstown, she'd be lucky to get 3 visits in a day because of the distance that she had to cover and the distance she had to travel. But her target was exactly the same as had she been based in Belfast, where her clients or her groups that she had to visit were in a very small geographical area. But in the wintertime, that would have been very difficult for her to cover that area or cover that number of visits. And so there's a differential. There's what we call the rural premium. So it's the cost of delivering services in rural areas. It's not going to be the same as delivering in urban areas.
Who should take the formal lead and coordinate between departments?
I think all departments should take a lead. I think it's a responsibility of all departments to take that lead. And that's not a get out. It's fantastic. The work that DART have done has been fantastic. They've been very joined up. I think they have a responsibility to ensure that rural doesn't lose out. But I think every government department has a responsibility to place its money and its priority for rural people as well as for urban people.
And secondly, Chairman, the local councils, these newly reformed councils, should they or will they have any role in trying to tackle rural poverty?
Absolutely. Any council that has a rural jurisdiction will have to develop a policy around tackling poverty and isolation in rural areas. So I think
And I mean, I could jump in there. Joe, certainly people in rural areas will expect their councils to take some whatever actions, and we know, I mean, councils have limited powers. Many of the councils in England or Scotland here are more limited powers, but certainly I'm sure local stakeholder groups, rural stakeholder groups will be asking councils to consider how they can make an impact on rural poverty, how they can spend their money differently, how they pay their staff, how they recruit their staff, all of those issues in terms of making sure that they can have some sort of impact in terms of their own area, how they look at economic development and ensure that the benefits of economic development that they're promoting in their areas is getting down to the more deprived rural communities. There's a great sort of interest at the minute in rural areas. Well, certainly in the Mid-Ulster Council area, there's a community planning process has just started. Community engagement events have started. The first one was in Dungannon about 3 weeks ago. Places were booked for 50 people. I think there was 120 people turned up. So there's definitely in that area, and Cookstown was the same, I think, in the Glenavon, you were at that one, Kate. There's a significant interest from rural community groups and community groups generally in local government, the new powers and community planning in particular. Now, you could argue that maybe some of that expectation, you know, it's a raised level of expectation, and that people's expectations of community plan are maybe too high, and that it obviously can't solve all problems, and councils will have limited budgets. But there's a definite interest, and we think that, and certainly from the councils that we have talked to and councillors that we have talked to, they are definitely interested in playing their part in terms of tackling rural poverty and isolation. They know it's an issue. They know it's an issue as the councils have expanded with larger rural hinterlands, and they're conscious of ensuring that as those council areas have expanded, they don't lose contact with the services that councils provide.
And I don't think it's, sorry, can I just say that I don't think it's a matter either of deflecting resources into rural. It's about ensuring a fair share of resources go to rural. I think where need is, we should follow where need and deprivation are, and that should be the priority. So if the need and deprivation is in an urban area or in a rural area, they should have fair share at those resources and a fair crack at the whip. The difficulty, as we've outlined in our brief, is that we just don't think rural disadvantage and rural deprivation is being highlighted enough within the statistical, and it's kind of a blunt instrument that's being used with NISRA at the moment, and there needs to be a more refined looking at how the indicators could encourage rural deprivation to be better identified by NISRA.
Okay, John, thanks.
Okay. Oliver McGowan.
Chair, thank you, and thank you. And I apologise for not being in to start your presentation. I always find this very, very interesting, what you're talking about. The Mara project, I find, is one of the most successful projects, and I think it hasn't been really rated yet, but will do in the future how important it has been. I think the whole secret of the Mara project now is to glean information out of it into practical use, and we haven't seen any outworkings of that yet, how we're going to do that. But I think that's for everybody to get their heads together and use that. You're quite right in what you're saying. The community groups are buying, and places have bought into the new councils, the new authorities, and you're quite right in that. But I think the new authorities will have a job in their hands to try and work this urban and rural now, because they have more councils together. You have 3 or 4 of them have councils together. How they're going to work with the rural programme, that's going to be a good one. You know, that's going to be the trick there, because the urban money has been withdrawn by the minister. So therefore, the only really big money out there is the rural development programme, and there could be conflict in council if they put the resources into the rural development programme for the rural dweller. The urban dweller are going to get, you know, all of those things there. Deprivation levels, the noble indices, I am not the biggest fan. I've said it time and time again, even in my 20 years in council, that they should be done away with, because the noble indices work against the rural dweller in quite a lot of cases, work against them instead of working for them. And the problem, to the chair, is that the deprivation levels, you'll have a bigger, higher deprivation in an urban area than you would have in a rural area. So, and it doesn't square up at all. So I think that all has to be looked at. But I think we have a great opportunity now of laying down a marker for the way forward on this whole thing. But I do honestly believe that the marker for the whole thing is the Mara project and the information that is brought back. I know in our own office that I keep in East Antrim, last year, and for the record, we ourselves brought in 238,000 of benefits unclaimed that we helped to bring in for people. Now that's a massive hole in the system. You know where I'm coming from.
Absolutely.
So well done, and I think you deserve support in all of this here, but I do hope we can find a way of taking the information out of the Mara project and putting it into practical use. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Declan McAleer.
Thank you, Chair, and sorry for being late for the beginning of your presentation. Get them in. Just want to pick up what Oliver said there and yourself, Kit. You made reference earlier to the methodology for medicine deprivation, referred to as a blunt instrument. How, in your opinion, is that impacting in rural areas? You know, how is it impacting on them, the fact that it's not capturing deprivation accurately?
I think one of the issues that we have is around that vulnerable people exist within rural areas, but they're not necessarily living in deprived areas. So how do you get to people who are vulnerable within a relatively affluent area? So we know that there are people of deprivation living in Bangor. We know that there are people of deprivation living in some of the more affluent communities that we have. And the work that we did with NISRA and the debate that we had, the Carnegie debate that we had, suggested that and Aidan's more, and well, Aidan's better equipped on this than I am, that Trutshasa talks about, you know, putting 18 or 12 legs on a stool instead of 3 or 4. So it's getting the right indicators to measure the right levels of deprivation. Aidan, I'm going to let you talk on the.
Well, I suppose, Declan, what you're after is, I suppose, what's the effects or what's the outworking of the current measure? And I guess if you're a policymaker, I would suspect in any government department, when you're writing a policy, and you know that policy is supposed to target deprivation, then I suppose your gold standard or your go-to set of indicators is the multiple deprivation measure. That's what, you know, I'm not a statistician, I'm not sure, you know, I don't understand all of the ins and outs of how the multiple deprivation measure is constructed, just as I'm sure most policymakers in government departments don't. But if their ministers tell them to write or design a policy constructed around to target deprivation, then the multiple deprivation measure is naturally what you would lift and go to. And when you go to it and look at most deprived, the 10% most deprived rural wards, none of them are rural. So if you're designing a programme based that is trying to tackle deprivation, it's going to miss out those rural households that don't fit within that multiple deprivation category. And I suppose the practical outworking of that was the Social Investment Fund programme, which targets the 10% most deprived. That's the criteria, the 10% most deprived rural wards. Now, at the time, we raised the issue with the department around rural deprivation. Now, in fairness to them, they did come back and said, well, if any community could make a case, a specific case for their area using other evidence, then the department would look at it, OFMDFM would look at it. But again, I suppose for us, it was, well, you know, I suppose Social Investment Fund was about tackling deprivation, tackling poverty, and I suppose to an extent tackling the legacy of the Troubles. But if you're using that 10% measure, which it did, then it'll be interesting to see if projects from that, if any rural projects are funded through the Social Investment Fund, because I would suspect not, because it's going to be very difficult for a rural community to produce objective evidence of deprivation in their area if they're not being, if their area doesn't show up well up in multiple deprivation measure. So I suppose that's a practical example of how that, the outworking of that, Declan. I don't know if that's what the question we're after.
And just switch up a little bit, is there, I know I attended the Carnegie event up here in the Long Gallery around a year ago.
Aye.
And I heard from NISRA and from Trutshasa. That's the question I'm going to ask you. Is there any other, how would you fix it? Are there other models or other examples of how a better methodology?
We've looked at Wales and ACRE in England, which would be a sister organisation of ours, which is Action with Rural Communities in England. In Wales they've looked at it as well, and in Scotland they've looked at it. And it's about refining the indicators. Now that's a statistical measure, and you know, we're not statisticians. But it's about understanding that, and if you give the example even of the three key indicators, and then there's one rural one about access to services.
Yeah, well, you've got that example. If you look at the multiple deprivation measure, there's a range of indicators. There's 7 domains across, which something like 52 indicators within those domains. Income and employment are the 2 most important domains, and they constitute 50% of the overall weight of the multiple deprivation measure. But you've also got a domain, access to services, which from a rural point of view, if you look at the wards that are deprived under the access to services domain, they're predominantly rural. I think the top one is maybe Rosslea or Brookborough.
One could you?
Canoe, sorry,
Canoe,
actually from
yeah.
your own constituency is up there as well. But there's a high degree of correlation between the wards that are income, education, employment deprived. So they're predominantly urban. So the same number of wards show up at the top of all those domains, but they don't show up at the top of the access to services domain. Those are all rural. Now, when we were having our Carnegie Challenge debate, Truth Haas, his view was that's because the model that NISRA are using isn't conceptually right. Now, I can't really make a value judgment on that. You were there that day as well, Dak. His argument seemed convincing, but I suppose it's about how you can try and construct a measure that takes account of this idea of location and people being far located from either jobs, services, or educational opportunities, and their ability then to access them. Because if you're living in West Tyrone or Fermanagh and are relatively well off and have access to a car, you can access those opportunities. You can commute for employment, commute for education. If you don't have the ability to do that, if you have a disability, for example, and there's no public transport or you can't get access to community transport, your life chances and your ability to access opportunities is severely constrained. So the model that they use looks at this idea of opportunity deprivation. And I think it's an interesting concept. I'd be interested. I understand he's coming to present to the committee as well.
Sorry, and I think as well from our perspective, the multiple deprivation measures work for urban deprivation. They work. I mean, it's not that we're saying that they don't work. What we're saying is that we need to have a different tool and a different set of measures for rural. And when we look at what our partners in Wales and Scotland and England are doing, they're saying it needs to be refined. There needs to be like a sifting down to a finer grain of working with the statistics that are available in order to be more rurally sensitive. And I think that's a key point for us, is about having a rurally sensitive index. But we would also urge caution that when that rurally sensitive index is used, that it's used correctly. Because like the multiple deprivation not working for urban, that rural index, that new rural index won't work for all areas. It'll work for rural areas. So it's a word of caution is in how it's applied as well.
The other complication you have obviously is as well that the multiple deprivation here is roughly, it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar model to England, Scotland and Wales. So there's obviously issues there in terms of comparability for, I suppose, even block grant purposes and, measuring deprivation across UK. So there's an issue there that needs to be considered, before when you're considering how you refine the measure for rural deprivation.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Sidney Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. And apologies for arriving late and missing your presentation. Aidan, can I pick up? I think you mentioned that meetings taking place maybe in Dungannon and Cookstown.
Yes.
You were surprised maybe that you were thinking maybe there's 50 turning up and there's 100 plus turned up at these meetings. Does that not send a message in itself that there's something wrong in the rural areas and that those people are missing out on something?
I think that there's a huge interest in community planning. There's been a massive anticipation for community planning coming in. So I think it's not a message that there is something wrong. I think people are just so keen to be consulted on what community planning will look like. They're hungry for information on how community planning will roll out, and they're keen to have. I sat at a rural development table in which there were 4 or 5 sports clubs represented, and they were just really keen to have their issue put on the agenda and for people to understand and know the broader context of the work they're doing, not just the sport they were providing and the sport services they were providing, but also they were keen for the new council to understand that they had a role to play in the development of those communities. I think, and maybe it's just a point of clarification, that they weren't just rural groups coming along to those meetings. That was the Mid-Ulster constituency. They're running, I think it's 8 or 12 consultations over the next couple of months. The new council, which is Cookstown, Magherafelt and Dungannon. And I think there's a number of groups in there who've been in contact with their local council over the last number of years and been supported by their local councils over the last number of years, who aren't sure about how community planning is going to roll out, and they're very keen to be at the table. But nobody's really clear about how they will be at that table. So the Burnavon, the queue at the Burnavon, there was supposed to be, I think, 80 people turn up, and there was over 120 turn up.
It's good to get that engagement. But
it's phenomenal.
I would see it as a positive.
It's a hugely positive.
That there is a good engagement and a good interest.
Yeah. I think, Kate, you said as well that what you'd like to see as a fair share of resources. Would you say that in the past that, I'm a rural dweller myself, would you say in the past that the rural dweller maybe did not get the resources that were probably more sent into the urban areas for different reasons, and the rural community was more or less at times the forgotten people
I think
in certain areas?
absolutely. And I would say that I'm a community development advocate, probably a community development junkie. And I would say that in very many areas, if the community didn't do it for themselves, it wasn't going to happen. And they could have got tired sitting around waiting for anybody to pick up on what was needed to be done in their area. So, I mean, some of the community groups that I work with who are in very dispersed rural settlements, they provide the luncheon club, they provide the community venue, they provide the dance classes, and they do the fundraising locally to ensure that the sporting activities or whatever cultural activities happen within their locality. And they have become extremely resilient, and they've become extremely inventive. And I think when you look at social economy projects that are happening all around Northern Ireland and are being encouraged, what you see in local communities in many rural areas is that they've already had a social economy up and running for years and years and years because they've had to.
Yeah, they've had to do that around their churches and clubs, ever what the situation was, and they built that up, and certainly they have to be commended for that. But going forward, your work over the years, have you seen much movement towards resources actually heading towards more to the rural, or do you see going forward it'll still be a big problem? Criteria for grants funding and everything else against the rural, it's not always easy. We all work with community groups and we find it difficult to should it be even getting plots of land to put on, say, facilities, like they don't always be there. No. Whereas maybe if you're inside other areas, in the urban areas where different bodies have this land, it becomes available to them. But we see this holding back, and it's going to be a difficult way to bring the communities forward. But with your work in the past, have you seen movement that the rural dweller will be more taken on board here?
I think it would be disingenuous of us to say that there hasn't been a rural agenda within Stormont over the last while. We've seen it with the T-Box strategy. We did a piece of work around Beyond Belfast around contested spaces in rural areas, and that's written into the strategy. So where it was just about peace walls in the past, the work that we did along with CRC now ensured that that's enshrined within that document. Rural contested spaces in which there are invisible barriers to people accessing services in particular communities because they're of one persuasion or the other has been written into that document. I think there's a lot, we're not there yet, but we're getting there sort of. I think there's a lot of work yet to be done about taking on board that rural needs to have a fair share in terms of government resources. But I think we look at the Western Trust, we look at some of the really good examples. Craigavon Hospital operate a partial booking system specifically because there are people coming from far away to access their services, and to come at 9 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon would be virtually impossible for them to do. So, or they time it around a particular bus service getting into Craigavon so that people can avail, rural dwellers in particular can avail of the service, but at a time which is more suitable to them. It reduces the do not attends within that hospital waiting list, but it also makes it more accessible for people who are reliant on public transport to access those services. So we've seen a movement. It's not fantastic. We've seen a movement towards accommodating rural. We've seen the Western Trust and the Western Board do ambulatory clinics which prevent people from having to stay in hospital 5 days in order to receive daily antibiotics. They can now get those if they go into a clinic in Omagh. Now, the caveat in all of that is that they've got the access to transport to get them to Omagh, never mind into Annagalvin, and they've got the resource to do that. But we've seen a rural differential being taken account of, but there's a lot more work to be done.
And your organisation will be, and the new councils were touched on here, do you see yourselves going forward with more engagement with the new councils in the future?
We'll have to have. I mean, our job is to articulate the voice of rural communities, and specifically people who are in poverty and isolation and rural disadvantage, and our job will be to lobby those councils to ensure that they're stepping up to the plate for the fair share for rural. That will be our role.
And I know that the Minister had been here briefing about her intention to bring forward or look at the possibility of bringing forward legislation on rural proofing. And one of the things that we had raised with the department a few months ago was the idea of, well, you know, government departments are in the executive have signed up to rural proofing, but there's no real compulsion or, well, there's no sort of agreement at local government level in terms of rural proofing, and there may be an issue there to be considered in terms of how councils think through the issue of rural proofing when they're thinking about how they deliver their services to a rural hinterland.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, thanks. Excuse me. Thank you very much for the presentation. Apologies, I didn't about just a couple of minutes, but I did hear your presentation. One of the queries that I have is around the different age groups. Because we're talking about anti-poverty and social isolation in the rural areas, would you see a significant difference between age groups in respect of either rural isolation or social exclusion?
Well, we think there's definitely an issue with older people, but I think that focus maybe, we have to be careful. I always say there are an equal number of children born with disabilities to parents who live in rural areas as there are in urban areas. So the demographic need is need wherever it is, and I think there's a need to be realistic that for a young person who's isolated living in Carrickmore, who wants to get back into employment, education or training, and who wants to access that, you know, there's a bus journey cost for them to get into, say, Omagh FE College or some of the colleges there. And we need to take account of the fact that it costs more money for a young person living in Carrickmore to access education and training or get back into that than it would do for someone living in the centre of a town who could walk to that facility or who would have access to a number of choices.
Yeah, but would any evidence that you have or information suggest that is worse either in the older generation or younger generation? Because obviously it doesn't matter, you know, if you live in Carrickmore or Roslay or wherever it is, it's different to living in the centre of a town where there's much more access to services. Because quite often your youth club or your leisure facilities maybe 20 or 30 mile away. Your hospital is probably that distance away as well. Maybe indeed your GP sends you for a scan to a hospital. You know, the point I'm trying to make, would you see that it's worse within an older generation or a younger generation group of people that they feel more isolated or socially excluded?
No.
I think it's hard to point to evidence on, but again, I would go back to the evidence that has been collected by Mara, and I think, you know, the questions like the question you just asked would be really interesting to see if that information could be gleaned from the Mara database. You know, having talked to all those households and identified what the issues were in those households, I think that potentially could answer some of your questions. But one thing I would say in terms of looking at some of the statistical evidence that has been carried out, you know, we know that families with 3 children and more are at a higher risk of poverty, and the evidence would show that in the rural west there are a higher proportion of those families in the population, so that's an obvious risk group. Now, if you look at the DSD's Family Resources Survey, it doesn't necessarily break those families down by, they talk about the rural west, which also includes large towns in the rural west as well. But that's so there's a potential risk group there, people at risk of being in poverty. Social isolation, I suppose, is a harder concept maybe to pin down. Obviously, older people living on their own in a rural community can be isolated. Alternatively, you know, sometimes in rural areas, if people have been there for a long time, there are good community and neighbourhood networks and good support there that people living in cities and towns can't avail of. And people can be very isolated in the middle of a big city. So I think it's to me, social isolation is a harder concept to pin down, and I think that's why, potentially one of the reasons why that Mara database could be really important in terms of interrogating that. And now obviously there'll be a cost to doing that, and that's another factor going forward, thinking about who will do that work and what can be invested in terms of the cost of trying to pull the information out of that can inform future programmes.
Okay, don't know whether I really got an answer to the issue, whether you see a difference between generations, but anyway, we'll leave it at that. The one other query, Chair, I had was around rural proofing. How important do you see the future of rural proofing being to the subject that we're talking about?
I think it's hugely important. I think we've been advocates for rural proofing for a very, very long time. We've been saying that, and it is back to this issue of fair share. It's about this issue of making sure that rural areas are no less deprived simply by virtue of the fact that they're rural, and that they get, they get no less of investment. As a ratepayer, I pay the same rates in the rural area that I live in a very rural, isolated area, as someone who lives in the centre of Magherafelt. So, I shouldn't have any different access to services or any different service than someone else, and I shouldn't have any less opportunities than anybody else as a result of that. And I think it's very important that rural proofing is a way of ensuring that rural areas don't lose out and don't fall into deprivation simply by virtue of the fact that they're being ignored or forgotten about and they're not factored in. But rural proofing has to have teeth. It has to have some sort of a way of compelling government departments to do something about it.
Do you believe it needs a legislative base?
I would like to see that it would have. I'd like to see it on the same agenda as equality agenda. I'd like to see it have the same. I think the equality agenda. I think the discrimination, Disability Discrimination Act, all of those acts that have legislated against vulnerable groups have been very successful, and I think rural proofing, if it was legislated for in some way or was given teeth in some way, so that it was given due countenance when considering services and service delivery, couldn't be a bad thing if it helps people who are disadvantaged and vulnerable in whichever context.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a million. Thank you.
Oliver,
Quickly, Chair, thank you. When we talked there about the proof, in deprivation in rural areas now, I'm only sort of going in the modern day immigration. A lot of the young people that emigrated have come from rural areas because of lack of what's going on. They can't afford to stay at home not working, they can't afford to travel to work, there is no work. Social media would tell you that. When you look at social media with the young people, I know I sit talking to some of my young ones at home there, and the conversation's been on there. Disability services, you mentioned that. Well, disability services now more and more are being centralised and are all moving in towards, gravitating towards towns or cities or that, and you have to go to the services there for treatments where you used to go out patients to clinic for speech or for hearing or whatever, but now it's all centralised. I know from our own disability group at home, our members are travelling further and further each year for the services they used to travel a few miles. They're now travelling into double figures. And social services there for when young people sign on when they're unemployed. They're called into the unemployment offices now, 18, 20, 25, 30 miles from their home, and they have to go in there. They have to be in there at a certain time. They have to be all of us. That's assassinating a journey in a bus or whatever. I think there's ways around that they could make that a little bit simpler for the young people. I don't think they're taking into consideration the rural and urban context there of that service, and that has been highlighted time and time again. And that's one thing there that is, if you talk to the young people in the rural areas, if you did, those who are unemployed will tell you that. Where do we get the money to go in there, the money to have to live on? There's no need for the half of this here. I think more of those went out to visit the young people. The system they had years ago worked. It would be more cost effective in bringing the young people in and paying them back and whatnot. It really is horrendous what they're putting the young people through, and it's no wonder that a lot of them's leaving. Thank you, Chair.
okay. Can I say, as I see quite a number of organisations that work with rural people and are organised in rural issues, is there a joined-up approach between the organisations all? On the outside looking in, it looks that they're fragmented, and to me it would look better if they were working closer together on the issues.
We do work very closely together. We have a sister organisation with the Rural Development Council, and the rural support networks were established through Rural Community Network, it advocated the support of those organisations and the establishment of those organisations right across Northern Ireland to ensure that there was a coverage right across Northern Ireland. I see the organisations as being, we're all very strong as organisations, but the rural support networks have done a phenomenal job in rolling out MARA. That, but the very virtue of the fact that that infrastructure was in place enabled the department to put something on the ground very quickly. As an organisation, our job is really more around policy and strategic intervention, but we are very much connected right across from NIRWIN, the Rural Support Networks, and ourselves and Rural Development Council. And those links are building and becoming stronger all the time. So I think we are a very functional family of organisations, but we have a niche market. And our organisation is very much around advocating on a policy level around changes in rural development.
Okay. Any other questions, everyone? Okay. Can I thank you both very much?
Thanks very much.
Kate and Aidan.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Move on to agenda item 6. We have an oral briefing on the Dard Nitrates Action Programme 2015 to 2018. Can I refer members to the memo from the clerk at page 133 and papers from the department or at page 136? Can I welcome Brian Irvine, Principal Officer, Head of Environmental Policy Branch, Alistair Carson, Assistant Secretary, Department Scientific Advisor, and Ian McCluggage, Agriculture Inspector, Grade 1, Head of Dairying, Pig and Poultry Development Branch. You're all very welcome. Can I ask you to make your presentation, and we will then ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Chair and Committee. Yes, and you've introduced Alistair and Ian, and I suppose this illustrates how we try and take a joined up and cohesive approach across the Department of the Nitrates Directive, with science, with policy, and with the advisory side, all involved in the process. And of course, Nitrates Action Programme is joint legislation with DOE, so we work with DOE and IEA on it as well. Previously, we'd briefed the committee on the 27th of May prior to the public consultation on the proposed action programme for 2015 to 2018, the next 4 years. And really the purpose of today is to update you on the consultation and how we've made progress in the whole review of the action programme and the NAP for the next 4 years. With 11 responses to the consultation, it doesn't sound a lot, but there were very detailed, considered responses. For example, Ulster's Farmers Union and NIAPA represent a big number of farmers. Since the consultation closed, we've given careful consideration, both within DARD and with DOE and IEA as well, to the consultation responses, because the industry did raise concerns about the practicality and workability of some of the measures that were proposed. And we've worked hard to address those concerns as far as we can to make the action programme practical and workable for farmers, while still achieving compliance with the directive and at the same time satisfying the Commission. So that process has been ongoing for a couple of months, and we're nearing conclusion on it. Now, to put it in context, every 4 years we must review our action programme and basically get Commission approval for it. And as well, because we have the derogation from the 170 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year limit in the directive, that derogation applies to more intensive cattle farms. We need to get that decision renewed and approved every 4 years. And the Commission will only consider a derogation application when it's satisfied that the action programme is acceptable to them. So the two things are closely linked. And in terms of the derogation application, it actually goes before the EU Nitrates Regulatory Committee, made up of representatives from all member states, and it must get a positive vote of approval before it becomes law and you are granted your derogation. We're on schedule to have our derogation decision go before the Nitrates Committee on the 11th of December for a formal vote of approval. So just a background to the review. It's that 4-year cycle, and it's an opportunity for us to put forward changes to the action programme that we feel based on science, policy and technical developments. But it's also an opportunity for the Commission to seek measures and issues to address things that have maybe come up across the piece, across Europe, that they then want to follow up with each member state, and the 4-year review is their opportunity to do that. And I know in this review it is maybe there have been things have popped up that maybe we didn't expect, but we've been able to address those, and those are things that the Commission raised, but they didn't raise it solely with us. It's things they're raising with all member states. And I think I'd like to make it very clear that when the Commission's looking changes, people maybe think, and farmers think that, oh, here we go again, they're tightening things, we're not doing a good job. But that's not the case. It's the nature of the process, and there's an evolution and a 4-year review. And the Commission are very clear that we have made good progress in water quality here, and there's a lot of good things we've done and done well. And even back, it's now quite some time ago, but all the investment that was put into storage through the Farm Nutrient Management Scheme, that has really stood us in good stead. And then the other things we're doing, like the MET scheme and the SBRI and SUPL for poultry litter, those are all good things we're doing. So while the Commission may want some measures put into the programme, they do acknowledge we're doing a good job. And really what they're saying is we want to see that progress maintained, and we want to just have comfort that expansion and what they see in going for growth, just to be sure that there's measures in place that we're not going to reverse any of the good work that's been achieved. And in terms of what's going on with other member states, the Commission doesn't really discuss that with you, but I would make it clear that they do say, well, there's infringement cases against maybe 6, 7 or 8 member states ongoing at the minute. So we're doing a good job, but the message is keep up the good work, I suppose. In terms of the action programme and the substance of it, of what we're proposing, largely the measures that were in the existing programme have been rolled forward. And there were areas there that we had quite a bit of debate with the Commission on, the closed period for splitting slurry being one of them. But there's no changes to that proposed this time round. The areas that we had the opportunity and have put forward changes are to do with the nitrogen application limits on cereal, an NMAX system, a simplified system, P availability of manures and low P soils, and an increased allowance for phosphorus on silage at Index 2. And we've split the soil index into 2 for more precision, really, nutrient management. And there are things that the Commission are wanting some measures to deal with splitting slurries, manures and fertilisers and sloping land, definition of flows on ground and manure exports, and they had issues on the management of poultry litter. In terms of now looking at how's the water doing, what progress are we making? Well, generally, nitrate levels here are low and they're stable or decreasing. Our issue really is with phosphorus. Now, in the phosphorus levels, they are stable, but we still have 50% of rivers and 70% of lakes are nutrient enriched primarily with phosphorus. So that's our, I suppose, our key area of focus, and particularly linking that to the Water Framework Directive. To get to good ecological status. And if we look at we've 27 major water bodies, river or lakes and reservoirs and things are classified. Only 8 of those are high or good status. 19 are poor, moderate or bad. So there's that issue there. While we're making progress, we need to be conscious and keep the focus on managing phosphorus inputs and managing that efficiently. Now, managing phosphorus inputs efficiently as well has benefits in terms of reducing cost of chemical fertilisers needed. And if we look at our overall Northern Ireland agricultural phosphorus balance, we're in surplus by about 12 kilos a hectare. So there's scope to use manures more efficiently and reduce the amount of chemical P fertiliser being needed. Just in terms of that link to Water Framework Directive as well, the Commission is focused on that this time round particularly, and the Water Framework officials are in the meetings with the nitrates officials as well, particularly for us because our action programme applies across all farms here. So the action programme is the fundamental agricultural measure, the basic measure as it's called, for Water Framework. Okay. In terms of changes that we have made to the proposed programme following the consultation, and this is really to take account of the concerns raised by the industry, and I'll take you through, there's 5 major changes. The covering of outside slurry stores has been deferred. We're not going ahead with that in this action programme, and over the course of the next action programme we're going to do some more scientific work looking at the benefits and also look at the costs, and as well that's linked to a whole area of work that's starting to develop now in terms of reducing ammonia emissions, because ammonia emissions are a key issue and it's coming increasingly into focus with the National Emission Ceiling Directive coming from Europe, and as well it's coming under focus at the meetings of the Nitrates Committee as well. So we'll be doing more work and analysis on it, and it may be that there are other measures that a farmer can take to mitigate ammonia that might be more cost effective than covering outdoor slurry stores. Secondly, in terms of records of manure exports, in light of the issues raised by the industry, change the date of submission to make it take the date away from a busy time for farmers. As well, we're phasing that in so that in the first year, the requirement to submit the records, it won't actually become a breach or a penalty offence until the following year. So there's a bedding in period, a phasing in. Then, in relation to controls, phosphorus controls on manures with a high phosphorus-nitrogen ratio, again, that's going to be phased in, and it's not going to come in until halfway through the action programme, so it won't come in until January 2017. Now, in the interim period, we intend to do some work subject to funding, research work on looking and analysing the phosphorus levels in some of these manures that would be classified as high PN ratio, that would fall into that bracket. Because what the committees may be aware of with the poultry litter, with broiler litter, there'd been significant work done there based on AFBI research to reduce the phosphorus content of the diet, and that had reduced the phosphorus content of the manure significantly. Now, there's been reductions in the P content of the other poultry diets, but there needs to be a rigorous scientific analysis done to find out just how much that's taken down the phosphorus content of those manures. So that measure applying to those high P manures won't come into 2017. As well as high P manures, that will also, that ratio and threshold, that applies to digestate from anaerobic digesters. And some of them, if they had a lot of phosphorus inputs, would actually have high phosphorus ratio. So it's scientifically justifiable that those would have excellent controls on it. In terms of another change we've made, the closed period we proposed that it applied to all chemical fertilisers, not just nitrogen and phosphorus. But in terms of potassium or potash, there can be on occasions a need to apply potash in the autumn, so we have an exemption to allow that, so we've built that in. And as well, the other change we've made, there was a proposal to require the covering of poultry litter stored in concrete middens to be covered, and that we're not proceeding with that requirement. Again, that was a significant concern raised by some in the industry. So, in short, we've made these changes to try and deliver a more workable action programme that helps farmers and achieves the benefits in water quality, that makes it workable. And we've had to negotiate that with the Commission. The stage in the process we're at, we're waiting just final sign-off from the Commission. They've seen our draft regulations, but we don't at this stage envisage anything major. We would be surprised if they raised any major concerns at this stage. And then, if the Commission's satisfied there's an acceptable action programme, then we go forward with our derogation decision to the Nitrates Committee on the 11th of December. And that requires a positive vote. So the next stage is that when we get sign off from the Commission, we'll finalise a synopsis of the responses, and that will be forwarded to the committee. But we've sort of briefed you on the major issues and changes we've made there today. In terms of just to update the committee as well, it was on the bottom of the briefing note there about the poultry litter and the sustainable use of poultry litter project. You'll recall we had the SBRI, and maybe even to wind back from that, just it was probably May 2012, I think. I was here with Dr. Sinclair Main, and we presented on the Dard Affby review. We'd looked at alternatives, and then that led to the SBRI. But at that time in our review, and I remember the words because we discussed about the various technologies and whether anaerobic digestion was feasible. And I think I described it as, while it was technically feasible at that stage, it was probably cost prohibitive. Well, what has come out of the SBRI process is that there have been recent developments in anaerobic digestion and how to modify that process that really show that it's much more feasible now to deal with poultry litter in that way by modifying the AD process. So after the SBRI, we've then moved to the Sustainable Use of Poultry Litter loan scheme. And that was launched in June, and that has up to £12 million of funding in terms of loans available. And that project really is managed by Strategic Investment Board with DETI and ourselves and Invest NI. The loan scheme closed for applications, expressions of interest several weeks ago, and 5 have been received. So there's positive things coming out of that, but because it's a competitive process, I can't really go into the detail of any of those applications at the minute. But I suppose there's work behind the scenes progressing there, and as well, 3 weeks ago, Tony O'Neill, Chair of Agri-Food Strategy, was here, and Tony did indicate as well that in his previous role in Moy Park that things were progressing well, and certainly with that SUPL project we have been liaising closely with Moy Park. So it's a work in progress, but things are moving the right way on it, we would say, at this stage. And as well, that's been one of the things that has been very helpful, and one of the major things to agree with the Commission in terms of how we manage nutrients and manage poultry litter in particular, and the demonstration that several government departments were taking forward this initiative was very helpful in their discussions with the Commission on it.
Okay. Well, as I'm aware, the committee requested a briefing paper on poultry litter. Has been
yes,
was one of the most major issues there is pending. And we're disappointed that we didn't receive that briefing paper for the meeting today.
Well, certainly there's some lines included there in the bottom of the briefing paper, and I suppose we're very happy to update you further down the line when the actual competitive process of the SUPL project is further advanced, but we'd be more than happy to come and present to the committee and with colleagues from the Strategic Investment Board who are managing the project at a suitable point where we're able to discuss things maybe a bit more when they're more advanced and loans have been progressed or awarded.
The current derogation ends on the 31st of December. You're confident that we can get another derogation?
I would hope so. I mean, the discussions with the Commission have been positive. they've already drafted the legal decision to go forward before the Nitrates Committee in December. So at this stage, we don't have any indications otherwise that it won't be going forward for a vote.
Okay. We're aware that there's a proposal for a new plant, anaerobic digestion plant at Ballymena. Okay. And I've done the figures here, and it looks like it can, if approved, can deal with up to 32,000 tonnes of poultry litter per year. How important? I mean, what's the overall tonnage that we're talking about then?
Well, what's produced at the minute is roughly 200,000 tonnes. Okay. There's a variety of outlets for that. Land splitting on arable land here, land splitting on pasture here, which isn't the best from the botulism point of view and the phosphorus point of view as well. There's a significant quantity goes to mushroom composting, both here and in the south.
Okay.
There are also small tonnages going to anaerobic digesters here and there, but they're small quantities. There is an increasing quantity goes to the south for plain land splitting on arable land, and there is some going to the Westfield plant in Fife for power generation as well. Okay. So there's a variety of outlets, and certainly one that, while the SUPL is developing and that's aiming to get processing plants here, there is scope for increased exports to tillage land in the south. Quite significant scope there, and we've been working with our colleagues in the south and DAFM, and that's one of the drivers behind the recording of manure exports and things like that. And that was something the Commission wanted, but we need a system, a recording system similar in the south, so that the two systems are compatible. I suppose one of the things about the directive, this 170 kilos of nitrogen limit, and it sounds all very complicated, but in principle, that's really about shipping manure about or spreading it about so that it isn't applied, there isn't too much applied in one place. And when you go to the continent, you know, yeah, great, ship it, export it to places where people want it, you know. And that, I suppose, is what is starting to be done more here, because poultry litter, it is a great fertiliser. It's a good organic fertiliser, provided you get it to areas that need the nutrients and where there's not a botulism issue as well. So it's good fertiliser in tillage land. And as the price of chemical fertiliser goes up, it's an increasingly more valuable commodity rather than a nuisance to get rid of. Yeah.
Are you confident that the sustainable use of poultry litter loan scheme will find a different solution?
Yeah, well, what it'll be, if I could describe what processing or some of these processes will aim to do, it'll get energy out of the poultry litter and generate renewable electricity and get revenue from that, but also you've still got the nutrients, but in that processing then you will put the nutrients into a form that is more concentrated, and the nutrient formulation could be adjusted, and therefore it's easier to transport and export. And the fact that you've generated revenue out of it just makes the cost benefits and makes the economics stand up better.
Okay. Joe Bourne.
Thanks, Sean. I welcome the presentation, Chairman. I'm intrigued by the mixture of science, policy and advisory. Are you all at one? Are you all at sea?
We're all at one, yeah, because we've been at this process for over a year in terms of the review and stuff, but yeah, I mean, our policy is based on science, and that's what has always been our strength in going to Europe. We've had very good science from AFBI. And
okay,
then,
Brian, I'll take that in good faith. In relation to the intensive agriculture that we have here in the north, and the case of you having these ongoing discussions with Brussels, what's the objective we want in terms of greening? What objective do we want in terms of greening and compliance?
Well, in terms of compliance with the nitrate selective, it's really demonstrating that we're keeping the nutrient levels in our water low and they're reducing. And our key issue is really it's in the lakes more than the livers, but like 50% of the livers have nutrient enrichment from phosphorus, but it's 70% in the lakes, because what flows in the livers gathers in the lakes, and there's a long-term issue there with phosphorus tied up in the sediments. But it's really, I suppose, that the challenge going forward for Northern Ireland agriculture is managing phosphorus input sufficiently. And we've certainly hugely reduced the amount of phosphorus chemical fertiliser going on, but there's a lot of the phosphorus input comes in terms of concentrate feed, in terms of all the feed to feed the intensive industry that largely comes through Belfast docks. Like, if we continue to intensify, you're bringing in more and more phosphorus, and then it's going onto the land in terms of manure through the animals. But if you look at other member states where they've been very intensive, if you get down that line to manage phosphorus, what really you need to do is get into manure processing to take out the phosphorus to some extent and reduce it. But that's if the industry gets more and more intense. But in terms of the cattle industry here and sheep, I mean, our advantage is that we can grow grass and we produce milk from grass rather than from feed. But if the industry goes down a line of more and more concentrate feeding, then the consequences of that in terms of nutrients need to be managed.
And will there be statutory requirements for the animal feed importers to configure their compounds so that it doesn't cause further intensification of some of these chemicals, and the same for those that produce the fertilisers?
Yeah, well, maybe just in terms of the research which has been undertaken, particularly in phosphorus, which Brian indicated is a major issue in terms of water quality. There's been significant research to look at lowering phosphorus in diets for both the intensive and ruminant livestock sectors, which have reduced the overall P levels, phosphorus concentrations in animal feedstuffs to a level that doesn't impair reproductive performance, where the concerns were, or production in terms of milk yield or growth rates. And it significantly improved the phosphorus balance on farms in Northern Ireland. And to underpin the derogation for the intensive grassland farms, there was a detailed scientific study looking at nutrient management to ensure that nutrient losses were minimised in that type of system, and that's one of the key bits of scientific data that has been generated to underpin the derogation in going forward.
Yeah, and in terms of the work with the feed industry, I mean, DARD has a voluntary agreement with NIGTA to reduce the P content of the feed, and that stems back to the first action programme, and they've stuck to that, and they've actually, it's slightly lower than the target level, so that has reaped good benefits. But what has happened over the years as well is, while the P content has come down, the overall quantity of feed coming in has gone up, so, you know, phosphorus is nudging up a bit, so we just need a bit of focus and vigilance there.
And lastly, Chairman, on the old poultry litter that's spread all over the place, I'm intrigued that, Brian, you're revealing this, that it could be an export product that could go south of the frontier to the south. Is it normal practice that poultry litter in Europe is processed in that way?
Oh yeah. The poultry litter goes all over the place in Europe. Yep, you'll find poultry litter down from the Benelux countries down in northern France.
So really, we don't need this big plant that has been talked about for a long time.
You know, I was about to add another sentence there too, was that because of the intensity of production, there is an incinerator in Moerdijk in Holland, which the committee had previously visited. So there's not much been produced. Yes, the stuff goes into an incinerator, but there's poultry litter moved all over the place, and I suppose maybe transport's slightly easier there. But in terms of manure shipments, this manure moves all over the place, particularly in those Benelux countries. Yeah.
Much has been spent so far by DARD on this project that has been talked about for years. This joint ETA DARD project on an incinerator.
I wouldn't have the figures just a hand, but it's not significant. We pay between Dart and Detty. We fund project management fees for SIB, the project team that funds it, and the funding, the 12 million funding for the loan scheme, has been provided from. I mean, it's Invest and the FP provide that, so it's not Dart budget.
What about the Strategic Investment Board? You made reference to them earlier on. Is this a paper desk exercise, or is it a meaningful research project?
Oh no, they manage the whole SUPL project, and they manage the SBRI in terms of applications and diligence and scoring and monitoring and managing all those projects. Yeah, and they're heavily involved in the management of SUPL. They're the project managers and would liaise with the various companies applying. Yeah.
Thanks, Chairman.
Okay, Edwin Poots.
Yeah, in terms of water quality, obviously there's a major investment made a number of years ago. Has there been a significant improvement in water quality identified since?
Yeah, well, that's what we're seeing. I mean, the nitrates levels are decreasing generally. The phosphorus levels are stable or decreasing. So, yeah, there has been improvement. And what we're also seeing...
In both rivers and lakes?
Yeah. The lakes are slower to respond. Yeah. That would be the thing. Alistair could look at the exact details. The lakes are slower now, but the rivers, there has been quite an improvement, and we have various tables here and things. But in short, flow gas and nitrogen, phosphorus is slower, and phosphorus tends to get stuck in the lakes and stuck in the sediments.
Yeah, and is it appropriate that all of Northern Ireland remains a nitrate vulnerable zone? We've got a very big loch in the middle of it, which catches an awful lot of nitrates and phosphates. You have your eutrophication that takes place there, but there's an awful lot of Northern Ireland which doesn't feed into that loch.
Yeah.
It feeds into other rivers and tributaries and so forth, but there isn't the same problems in those.
Well,
is it appropriate? Because, I get on a boat and I go over to Scotland, and it's a nice dry day in January, and the guys are out spreading slurry, and people here have tanks virtually full at that point in time. Is that appropriate to maintain, and is it something that we can seek to change?
Well, the science behind it shows that about 83% of the land area is draining into areas that are eutrophic or at risk of eutrophication, and the 17% are more upland areas and things. Now, if you took out those 17%, what has been an issue in other member states is that then, where there's no rules there, then you actually start to displace and cause a problem there with dumping and things. Now, in terms of the overall approach, I mean, way back 2004, it was consulted on in detail, and there was support right across the board. Largely, I mean, okay, some people met, but UFU and the main farming organisations went with the total territory approach. Now, if you look as well with member states and some of the ones that are in court, they're largely ones who are on designations and things. So, in practical terms, certainly I think it delivers more and it's better. And if you look at the whole of Ireland, it's all total territory. Now, if we were to argue for the Commission that there's a couple of wee dots up around here, up around the north that aren't really shouldn't be in it. It's a hard one to argue because the same thing applies in the south. I'm sure there's plenty of places, upland areas, that are little, very extensively farmed areas that the same would apply, particularly out in the west. But a total approach, I think, really has been beneficial.
In terms of the nitrogen and phosphorus, I've always led to believe that essentially our problem comes, and referring to what Mr. Byrne was talking about, we have such a large dairy herd and so forth for the land that we'll have available, that when you added the chicken litter into all of that that's whenever you had the problems. And certainly, whilst we've managed to accommodate things leaves me well at this point. We have the derogations. If the chicken industry is to expand as it would like to expand and perhaps double in size, that's just completely not doable under the current circumstances. Would that not be right?
Well, it's doable if the manure goes somewhere else.
Yeah.
Whether it goes through processing, more goes to the south, more goes to Westfield and Fife. So it is feasible. Now, there may be a cost with that, but it's feasible. And I suppose when you come to the loading on the land here, our end loading in terms of annual kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year from livestock manure, we're 117. A few years ago it was 118. So it's 117. The directive limit's 170. So we're below that. So there is scope within the practicalities to ship stuff about, but we've got to be mindful of the phosphorus. And of course, when you're dealing with manure from the intensive sector, be it poultry litter or whatever, well, a lot of the area, particularly if you're talking about dairy herds now, is already has its nitrogen loading is spoken for, it's taken, you know.
Yeah.
And as well, there's of course the great practicality of poultry litter going near pasture and dairy cattle and things.
Yeah, it's not the most environmentally friendly way of dealing with things by transporting manure for long distances either.
Yes, to a certain extent, but the consequence of over-applying it has also, you know, in terms of causing nutrient enrichment and water quality problems. And certainly things are shipped larger distances on the continent. And in terms of looking at the economics even for farms here, I mean, manure is valuable in terms of the nutrients. And maybe Ian would want to comment a bit, because I know there's been some work done on just how far does it pay you to ship a tanker of slurry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a common question that would be asked at farm level. I think a comment I'd make prior, the change with regards to the phosphorus status, splitting the index 2 into 2- and 2+, we were seeing evidence at farm level that, particularly in silage swards, there was a crop need, but because the soil had been tested at index 2, you couldn't apply. So being able to split the index will allow more of that home-produced nutrient to be used within the farm. But certainly with regards to transportation, you're looking that slurry can certainly be somewhere between 5 to 8 miles. It's economic for the farmer to take that, particularly, and I mean that's all relative to fuel prices and fertiliser prices. There's a balance. We've had a calculator, an online calculator that a farmer can log into and put in his own figures for his own farm situation. But certainly dairy farmers with beef and sheep farmers as neighbours, probably those beef and sheep farmers, a more economic way for them to improve grass production is by using the nutrients from the slurry that's produced on the dairy farm. And certainly in the pig sector, a number of years ago, farmers pig farmer would have supplied the tractor and the tanker. Now they can actually charge X pounds for each load of pig slurry because of the nutrients that are contained within that. And the economics of fertiliser prices have allowed that to happen.
In terms of middens, indeed open camp silage, great capacity to catch water, to pollute the water, and then you have to actually store it. Are there any notions that you might in future look at grant aid for covering middens and open silos?
It's not my area, but I do believe under the capital investment scheme that yes, that is an area that will be certainly considered. And again, there's good evidence from data we have from on-farm situations, the amount of rainwater that can be diverted into a dirty water tank, etc. Or if it's straight off a roof, can be taken away from the farmyard to minimise the amount of storage. There's good evidence there that is economic to do so, and it's not my area, but I would feel that that's probably something that's been seriously considered under the capital investment scheme.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And certainly under the capital investment scheme, middens for poultry litter has been seriously considered, because if we look back to Farm Euclid Management Scheme, the arable farmers who would install these middens actually didn't get funded, and because field heap storage was available, a lot of people, there wasn't investment in middens for poultry litter. So really, going forward, the best place to put poultry litter is in a covered midden.
Okay, Joanne Dobson.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank you for your briefing, and apologies for missing the start of it. Initially, I welcome the fact that the pressure from the Commission for longer closed period has not paid off. And can you maybe outline for us, if agreed with the Commission next month, can you confirm for us that this would mean that the closed period will remain unchanged up to 2018? Will? Okay. So in relation to safety, what work has the Department undertaken into the safety aspect of the Nitrates Directive, especially given, I think we have had 77 deaths since the directive was introduced? Can you maybe outline what measures have been taken?
Yeah, well, in terms of just the storage of slurry and if it's stored longer, and this was something that came up in the consultation, and maybe Alistair would want to comment on it, but certainly the experts in slurry management at Hillsborough said that actually storing it longer reduces the hydrogen sulfide in it.
Yeah, there's published work from Hillsborough which was looking at the effective length of storage of slurry within a tank on toxic gases, and found that it didn't increase the risk. There wasn't an increase in slurry gases produced over a long period of time. It can be related to the amount of headroom within a slurry tank in terms of the overall concentration, and obviously the speed of mixing and factors such that were found to have significant effect. But in terms of the overall length of storage for slurry, there wasn't an increase, and it didn't increase the risk.
Is there other ongoing work the Department are taking, given that this is such an important issue in Northern Ireland with the safety aspect, and one death is one too many, and as I said, I think it's 77 since it was introduced?
Yes, within the Evans Innovation Programme, there's a research project that's been undertaken in relation to slurry and slurry gases.
Is that ongoing, Alistair?
Yeah, it's just reporting at the reporting stage now.
Right. It's important to keep the safety aspect firmly on the radar. Finally then, in relation to the Commission's recommendation to restrict spreading on sloping land, how could you begin to work out, it's going to be very difficult, what land would be and what land would not be impacted, as how do you define sloping?
Yeah, this is something actually we went through in the last four-year review with the Commission, and it was some what would you say, risk analysis for steeply sloping land, and we produced a matrix there and worked it up in guidance with the industry. And just on that guidance, we have a comprehensive document, and Ian said online calculators and things, and we worked that guidance document up in consultation and partnership with the industry, with a guidance working group that FU and NIAPA and the agricultural consultants would actually sit on and work with us. But with that risk assessment for steeply sloping land in the guidance booklet, and it explains how you measure slope and things. But largely, we don't find this as an issue, and it hasn't been an issue of non-compliance, because one of the things is that natural practicalities and safety of putting machinery in steep slopes means people don't do it. But the issue that's come up this time round is, let's call it less steeply sloping land. It's less than 15%, rather than the stuff that's 15% and above.
Sloping, there's quite a
yeah, there's different
range.
slopes would be the best to say, but in terms of what's added this time, it's on the less steeply sloping, which is, I think, grassland less than 12 and arable less than 10, or somewhere about
15
that.
and 12.
Yeah, 15 and 12. But it's quite simple. There's not a need for a risk assessment. It's just, if it's at that slope, just spread further back from waterways is basically the way to describe it. We've kept that as simple as possible. You know, while the other risk assessment, when you go through that, there'll be occasions where it'll say, no, you can't spread if it comes out as high risk.
I would just be concerned with so many variations. It could be quite difficult or and over bureaucratic to administer.
Well,
You're confident it's not, Brian?
I can understand those concerns, and what I would say from last time, since then it hasn't been an issue, and NIA say this is not an issue, and we haven't been penalising farmers for it. We don't see it as an issue. So when you get the less steep land, I would hope that it wouldn't be any major issue for us.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Joe Byrne.
It's so much okay, thanks.
Okay, covered. Okay.
Sure. Just a quick
Sydney
one.
Anderson. Okay,
Thank you for your presentation. In relation to the poultry litter SUPL project, you talk about they pick up around 5 applications.
Yes, yep.
Right, okay. But the demonstrator plants is being promoted here. £12 million laid aside is 12 million.
Yep.
When you talk about, just to let me know what way this works, but how many plants would this be then?
Well,
There's all 5.
No.
Or would there be one? What does the 12 million relate to? Or could there be more?
Yeah,
You see where I'm coming from?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I'll explain where the 12 million came from. The outworkings of the SBRI, the conclusion was, in discussion with the industry, is that, well, yeah, there's things here, technologies look viable. What we need is to set these up at commercial scale, a demonstrator plant that would be 20 to 30,000 tonnes a year. Now, if you take the costings for a plant that size and you work out what 40% of that is, basically 12 million is 2 plants at a total cost of £15 million a plant, if I've got my maths right, but that's what it is. So those sort of plants, to set up a plant that's going to process 20 to 30,000 tonnes is 15 million. Now, a 40% loan for that is 6 million. 2 plants, 6 millions. That's where your 12 comes from. But that's the outline.
20,000 tonnes?
20 to 30,000 tonnes.
Right. So, and did you say earlier on then that we have is it 200,000?
Yes, yeah.
So you're, right, okay, good. Trying to put these figures together.
We don't need to process a whole 200,000 tonnes.
Right, okay, right.
There's quite a lot that can use sustainably. And back to our Dard Offbeal review, we calculated that even within arable land here, you can use about 100,000 tonnes sustainably.
Okay.
You know, so when you count up the Merslin composting, things going to the south, things going to the, you know, it's not that there's 200,000 tonnes to put through process.
And just quickly, what would be the time scale then? We'll talk about these plants, but what's the projected time scale for these?
That's a very good question. I could say that one of the key drivers for some of the technologies would be the renewable energy incentives and the LUX scheme. Now, that is currently there until March 2017. So that would be a clear focus for some of those plants that their economics would want to avail of those renewable energy incentives.
Point taken. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. In relation to cross-compliance and fines from single farm payment, I declare an interest in a farmer myself. I'm aware of situations, I mean, I think that, and I'm sure you agree or disagree, but I think that the NIA should be working closer with farmers and identifying problems, and instead of immediate fines. I know there's cross-compliance issue, but I mean, I know one instance just recently where there was a pollution issue in the river. Neighbouring farmer caused the pollution. This particular farmer actually had a problem with his effluent leaking, and he dug a hole beside the silo and put an immersion pump in. He dug a hole at the side of the river to stop and getting into the river. So then all that added with him, and he was fined 3% of every single farm payment. His neighbour up the road laughed at them and said, "I have no single farm payment, you just can do what you like." So he was very aggrieved that he actually was fined fairly heavily. I'm not so sure what will happen. They'd have to bring the other guy to court to fine him. But it just seems unfair that two neighbours, the man that did create the pollution problem was the man that walked away, and the man that didn't create the pollution problem actually got fined. Yeah, but I'm only saying that.
Yes, no, I understand, and that's a concern that's expressed, and we do understand that. I suppose what NIA colleagues would say is, yep, we're subject to the close compliance regime, an EU audit and everything else.
I understand.
But certainly, and UFU have made the point, well, that yes, can we get more of advice before there's a penalty?
Yeah, I think so.
You know, and that would be ideal, but sometimes the EU regime doesn't allow that. But that's certainly I mean, we'd be for a pragmatic approach if it can be adopted.
I'm also
within the-
aware, I'm aware of farmers that actually send their single farm payment over to their sons, so they don't claim single farm payments, so they don't even be inspected, and they're very large farms. But I'm only saying, the system, you know, if it was dealt properly, you wouldn't find yourself, you'd actually get a better result, probably, if there was more working with the farmer on the ground, you understand, rather than, because those farmers that want to walk away from it, there's maybe a small number, but there are those that can find ways around it, you know.
Yeah, indeed. No, that point, and certainly it is a thing that has been discussed with NIA, and I know you're discussing it with NIA as well. And going forward in terms of water framework, you know, this sort of advice on things is a good model to adopt. Now in Scotland, they have a thing, and where they have liver walks and advice and things, but slightly different there. They don't have total territory nitrates action programme, and their advisory agencies are different. But it's something that it's on the agenda. Now, I can't promise that all the problems will be solved, but there are issues there around that. And we would far rather have compliance than have farmers fined for non-compliance. And that's why we do have a significant advisory effort. And there's always an article every year on the Nitrates Action Programme when we see what the close compliance issues and the breaches have been. Every year we put out a press article and an article in the Helping You Comply bulletin that says here are the major things where the key issues where the penalties were coming from or the non-compliances were detected. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, and thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
I think it's probably Wednesday.
So this is Stratford Locks coming up now. It's coming up now, you have heard review, so...
Right, so
Anybody left?
there's only
Yes.
thank for luck here now.
Very much.
That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Can we move on to agenda item 7? We have an oral briefing, Dard and Strangford Lock. I can refer members to the memo from the clerk at page 140, papers from the department at page 146. Can I also refer members to an update from the department to the solicitors acting for the Strangford Lock Fishermen's Association at page 158. Can I welcome Ian Humes, Grade 7 Principal Officer, Head of Sea Fisheries Policy and Grants Branch. Can I ask you, Ian, to take no more than 10 minutes to address it, and we'll then ask you questions.
Sure thing. Well, you have, Chairman's team, the paper update on the Strangford Lock cod fishery for the committee. During the summer, we invited people to apply for licences to fish in Strangford Lock. That resulted in 30 applications, and the department awarded 20 licences. To be eligible for a licence, you had to have fished 25 days a year over the previous 2 years. I mean, that's a fairly low bar with just 50 days fishing. And that resulted in 20 people getting an award of a licence. In terms of the conditions associated with that licence, there was really nothing very new in it, apart from a requirement to tell us about what you did every week rather than every month. The rest of the conditions associated with the licence are either embedded in legislation or things that are, that are there already. But what effectively we did there was to complete what we call our phase 1 of the approach, which was to ensure that we put a cap on the amount of fishing that's going on in Strangford Lock, and that we identify who are the people who are fishing and who should be fishing there, and that we can move forward then and work with them through the Strangford Lock Fishermen's Partnership. So that's our first phase. I think the second one is going to be more interesting from the perspective of having to look at what grounds are available to them, what is the level of fishing the lock can support, what fishing activity happens. We've been a bit short on facts over the years, because this is a small fishery. It's fished by individuals who are largely fishing on their own. Small boats, pot fishing, low impact, fishing on stocks that are not quota species, and therefore there isn't the same interest in quantifying some of the things that they're fishing for. But that's all changed, of course, and we need to look at this fishery in a good deal more detail, and that is one of the reasons why we ask people to report on a weekly basis to us. And it's very, very early days. It's only really been going now 7 weeks. We have some information from that in terms of the amount of activity. Of those 20 people who had a licence, 5, for example, have not fished at all. 11 of those licensed vessels have fished for less than 20 days during the period. And indeed, 9 of them have fished for less than 10 days. So it's been a fairly low level of fishing activity by some of the individuals who have received licences. But as I said, we set the bar fairly low and took a reasonably generous approach to the evidence that we were tendered. But on the other hand, we see that 9 vessels are fishing more than 20 days of that 49-day period. Indeed, 4 of them have fished more than 30 days. And when we look at some of the information that they're providing us in terms of the number of pots that are being deployed, we see that, and again, we're relying on the returns that they're making. We know that there are some anomalies. We know that some of the forms are not being correctly completed. But on the basis of what we have, we can see that there are 5 of those licensed fishermen are fishing with more than 150 pots. And there's only 4 of them between 50 and 150, and then the rest of the fishers have either not fished at all, or 6 of them are fishing with less than 50 pots. That's a really very, very small amount of pots, and doesn't really indicate that those individuals are reliant upon their income from fishing as their main source of income. But we will know more. This is too early to say. This is just over a period, a snapshot over a period of September, October, and the weather has been very, very good. The number of days fishing reported has not been, when you look at the evidence that people gave us for saying we need a licence and here's how many days we fished in the last 2 years, there's been proportionately more fishing over the last 7 weeks than there has been in some of the previously reported. Now that could be just down to underreporting or overreporting, but we will be able to tie those things up with the department's observation records to know exactly what is going on in the fishery from now on. But we want to get down to the business of making sure that they get a good return. AFBI have been doing some work on the habitats being fished and trying to get a handle on how much and how good the fishing stock is there and how much can be exploited. And for every kilogram of fish that the Strangford Lough fishermen put on the quayside, we want to make sure they get the best return. So we'll be working with them in the future on issues around marketing and so forth, but that will come in a phase 3 of our approach. But, Chairman, that's really what I wanted to update the committee with today.
Okay, again, Ciaran McCarthy.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. First of all, I'm going to start off with, there seems to be a great deal of frustration between the fishermen and their organisation and yourselves. I mean, we start off with, solicitors writing to you, it would seem to me that there's a serious breakdown in communications or relationship between yourselves and the fishermen. Would you accept that?
No, because we have had a lot of contact with members of the association. I mean, I'm quite puzzled as to why we had a letter from them. Indeed, if you look at my reply, I remember seeing it at the time, I thought, look, we've dealt with all of those issues. We had a meeting, we dealt with that matter. We were accused of not consulting them on the terms of the permits, when in fact we had discussed that at the May meeting. We subsequently sent them out details of the permit proposals. They had a meeting themselves, they talked about it. they came back to us and said, look, we don't like this, that and everything else. We took that on board and we adjusted it accordingly. So it is a bit surprising to see some of the points that are being made in that letter to say that something has been ignored when very, very clearly it was in the meeting there. So if there is a breakdown of communication, I'm not sure which individual is responsible for approaching the solicitor, whether that was one of the individuals who was at that meeting or whether it was one of the individuals who was not at that meeting. But there is a communication problem, that I will agree with you, and something that I'm determined to deal with the next time we have a meeting of the group. Making sure that we have a memorandum of understanding, making sure that we understand how the information that is discussed at that group ought to be communicated, because pardon me, we very, very clearly sent them the information about the licence, and they discussed it. So I'm not sure why I'm disappointed. And the other point that I think about the meeting that we had in May is that we said, look, we can have another meeting of this group in 3 months' time, or we can have a meeting any time any of the members of the group want to have a meeting. So the door is always open, we're always available. We've had a lot of conversations with fishermen over the summer months, particularly from Strangford Lough, and particularly in relation to the licensing issue. So it does come as a surprise to get that.
Well, yeah, Chair, I mean, I hear what you say, but surely the very fact that the solicitors, the fishermen, or their association has to rely on solicitors to get responses and replies, and I'm looking at a response that you sent back to them.
Yes, Mr. McCarthy, but look at what we said in the response.
Well, I mean, there was a number of issues, and out of 9 issues, there were 5 ignored.
Sorry, which?
From yourselves. Well, the solicitors is advising you on the 19th of August that your response obviously was totally inadequate. And out of the 9 issues that they had raised, 5 of them were ignored. That cannot be considered to be best practice in anybody's language.
Okay, I don't agree with you that we ignored those issues, and I don't agree with you that our response was inadequate. I think that it is regrettable that they wrote to us, and I think it's regrettable that some of those issues were raised through this means and not over the telephone. We know these people very, very well, and we're very, very happy to discuss issues with them. But when you look at the things, the points that were there, and this goes back to, I think the problem was actually looking back at a previous piece of correspondence and not really taking stock of what happened during the May meeting that we had with the individual who obviously was involved in writing this letter. But
again, it's the length of time,
which point in particular?
The length of time you have taken to respond to these people. That seems to be. I mean, you must accept, Mr. Chairman, that the people, the small number of people that use Strangford Lough for fishing, whether it's for a living or otherwise, have been totally frustrated by the actions of Europe and what they have done. There have been restrictions all over the place, and the frustration is there, and it seems to be growing on a daily basis. I mean, the solicitor wrote to you last on the 19th of August, and when they pointed out about these issues being ignored, and it took you from the 19th of August, the whole month of September would pass before you even responded on the 23rd of October.
I accept that was unacceptable, but I would urge you to consider what we did say in the response to them. And if there are particular points there which you feel that we have not dealt with, well, then I'd be very happy to give an explanation or to give some more information. But I mean, I believe that letter, and again, it purports to come from some clients. I'm quite surprised, frankly, that those points were made in the letter of the 19th of August, whenever they had been dealt with back in May.
Right, but again, it took from the 19th of August.
Okay, I accept that. I accept that. But
that can't be acceptable, particularly in the circumstances that these people find themselves in.
is there anything that I can offer further explanation about?
Well, you mentioned a meeting. When do you plan to have a meeting with these people? I would have thought that a meeting would have sorted out these problems without all this solicitors' involvement, etc.
Sure. And that meeting happened in May.
Well, it's obviously there's time for another meeting.
It is, and we've been endeavouring to try and get another meeting, but I don't believe that there's any issues that are contained in the solicitor's letter written by someone within the association. I'm not sure how this organisation works in terms of its democracy, in terms of whether it was a committee agreement or whether it was an individual who decided to make the approach. I'm not sure. These are some of the things that I need to sort out the next time we meet with them, and we've been trying to get that, but it's just down to some personal circumstances that this has not happened.
Yeah, you say in your letter, I think, on the 23rd, where the association have lost out financially, and that we would just all agree with that.
Which part of that?
Due on the 23rd of October, where you have lost out financially due to the mobile gear ban preventing them from developing their oyster site. I mean, these are things that, I would have thought you as a department would have been leading to get these people into a proper footing to get them back to where they were prior to the restrictions in the Stratford Lock, etc., etc. And then there's the permits and there's licences. There's a whole cabal of stuff that needs to be sorted out. And surely I would have thought, a meeting with Dick James, for instance, I think, I don't know what his title is on the organisation. Dick James has been around a long time, and, is there not a common ground that we could sort the thing out and move forward?
Yes, I mean, the issue that you mentioned about mobile gear was banned in the lock in 2003. There was an issue then when the department was asked to look at the case for compensation. It did. This has come up, this has got a half-life, I don't know how long, but the issue has been addressed, it has been dealt with. Many, many years ago, and a conclusion reached. Now, again, we're moving on. We're in a completely different regime. We're moving on. Some 10 or 11 years later, people are still harking back to a circumstance that happened in 2003. We're now dealing with the management of a pot fishery. And there are many, many other issues in relation to some individuals and their involvement with the farming of oysters there. I mean, I believe that goes back to a time whenever some people seeded some oysters in Strangford Lough, but they've, I think the stock has largely disappeared now, largely disappeared because of others who have come and gathered oysters and taken oysters from the seabed, and little of it remains. So, this is an issue that is a very, very old one. It has been dealt with. It has been the subject of a number of questions in the House and a number of pieces of written correspondence with the Minister. And it is an old topic, Mr. McCarthy.
Well, finally, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to bore you to tears, but I mean, this document that you sent to the committee updating the Strangford Lough pottery, there's no date on it, but has that been relayed to the people that most desperately need information?
Well, I mean, my letter to, yes, they have. Sorry, I can't say that because there are 3 members of the association that were at that meeting in May. And whenever it was discussed, where we sent a copy of the minutes post that and sent a copy of the details of that there. And maybe, as I say, there may be a communication problem. I don't know. But I think there's something that we have to resolve to make sure that the work of this group is a good deal more transparent, and that the minutes are seen by all of the licensees. Now we have 20 people. It's not difficult to communicate with 20 people. And we will send them a copy of what is happening to a fishery in which they're involved in, so they can make sure that they understand some of the things that are being discussed at this meeting.
I'm surprised that hasn't been done.
Why?
Well, I would have thought, you said yourself, you admitted communication hasn't been good.
No, we haven't had 20 licensees until September. You
have an organisation that's looking after the group that's on the lock. I can't understand why they have not been kept abreast of your...
Some of them in correspondence with us are not in correspondence. Some of them in conversation with my team have said, look, they don't speak for me, meaning the association doesn't speak for me, so I'm having some difficulty. I need to tie this one down.
Finally, 30 applicants, 20 licences. Why was the 10 refused? Did they not reach a criteria?
Yes, that's precisely why, because they haven't fished very much.
And can you give the committee here an undertaking that you will do what is necessary to prevent any further solicitors' letters coming from whoever? Because somebody's going to have to pay for that. And the last thing we want everybody working together for the benefit of what's there for everybody to enjoy.
I will certainly try and deal with the breakdown in communications that has clearly happened, or the breakdown in someone's perception. I am not quite sure what led to this, but we will certainly deal with it. But I can't guarantee that they won't get another letter.
Will you do your best?
I will certainly do my best, yes.
To work together with them. That's grand. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tom Elliott.
Chair, thank you. And Ian Clowns, apologies, I missed your presentation to start. So if I'm going to ask something that you've already answered, then just tell me.
Okay.
I recall this some years ago, all coming up. Then I recall it on Environment Committee, and now it's back.
It's following you.
Can I ask around the relationship, not only with obviously the fishing fraternity there, but with DOE, because I do recall criticism at the time that the communication or cooperation between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environment wasn't all that it was expected to be either. Can I ask about that cooperation and that relationship at the moment over the issue?
I think it's good. There are several places where we come together. The DOE Marine Division and ourselves meet on a quarterly basis to discuss a whole range of things, including this. The department is also represented on a Modiolus restoration group together with DOE, which is looking at trying to restore the designated feature to a favourable condition. So that relationship is strong. We're working very closely with DOE. And
are you generally on the one page on the issues?
Oh, absolutely on the one page.
And can I go on then to ask about the relationship with the European Union on the matter?
Well, the point is that there was a complaint made to the Commission by Ulster Wildlife, and they were not happy that departments have been doing and dealing with the restoration plan. And departments responded to that and put a revised restoration plan to the Commission, and I believe that the UWT's position and the Commission's position is that they will withdraw the complaint and take no further action if the department continues to implement the restoration plan. Now, there are some things that I'm involved with doing and some things that others are involved in doing. For example, we have, as part of that restoration plan, agreed to exclude fishing from a certain area in the loch, and this committee will have seen that piece of subordinate legislation come through. From my colleague, Mark McCahan, who is head of the Sea Fisheries Inspectorate, his job is to make sure that there is a monitoring and control system in place to make sure that fishing doesn't happen there. And we're also doing that as well by controlling fishing through licensing conditions, and also through the regular monitoring of what they do. So that's the fisheries aspect of it. But then on the other side of it, there are a range of things that are happening there to look at whether or not it is possible through intervention to restore these Modiolus reefs or biogenic reefs to good condition. And they're looking at the moment at sources of the animal outside the loch to see whether or not that they can be brought into the loch so that can be re-established. That is the subject of a committee that involves both DOE, environmental NGOs, DARD, our scientists, and indeed the Strangford Loch fishermen. So it's not something that I'm directly involved in. I'm involved with the sea fisheries management aspect of it and the progression of that plan.
And if the Ulster Wildlife Trust withdraws his complaint, does that mean there will be no fine against the executive here?
Well, it would be, yes. Excuse me. We haven't got near a fine. You know, I'm not saying that in a complacent way. The process would be that the Commission begin this pilot case, which they did, and they look and they examine it, and they warn the Department if things don't change. They would then take the member state to court and recommend that the courts impose fines. So that would eventually go to the European Court before that would happen. But yes, this is part of a whole process of infraction. The pilot case is part of a process. And if the Commissioner is satisfied that the departments have been acting properly, well then that pilot case will be closed, and the risk of fines will disappear. That's right. But it is part of a long and complex process which would eventually end up in the European Court.
And finally, Chair, sorry for this, but it's a wee way from I've heard about this aspect. Finally, is there any danger at the moment of any breaches to the proposals or the process that you are taking forward in the log?
Yes, there is. First of all, we have a fisheries exclusion zone, and if fishing happens in that part of the loch, well then that's something obviously that we don't want.
Yeah, but is there any evidence of that happening? Or
there's no evidence that I'm aware of that happening. Okay. I think that our fisheries inspection boat at one stage last year pulled a few pots that were right on the margins. This is a very, very complex zone. This is to do with water that is below 10 metres in depth, and it exists on Admiralty charts, and fishermen are aware of that because of the sounders and other things that are on board. But if they have been fishing close to the edge of the zone, then maybe there might be some incursion. But, I'm not privy to, full-scale disobedience, if you like, by fishermen. That's not coming through in our records.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Chair.
Okay. Joe Byrne.
Yeah, Chairman, we're told all the time that fishing quotas and fishing restrictions are dependent on the scientific data. Is the independent scientific data collected for Strangford Lough? And secondly, how would the EU bring in fines if there is a lack of authentic data?
The first bit is, yes, scientific data is beginning to be collected for the loch. We have AFBI working there, carrying out pot surveys, carrying out stock surveys, aiming to try and tell us what kind of fishing stock is in the loch and what kind of fishing effort the loch can withstand. Because if you overfish something, well then it's not going to be there in future years for future generations. I mean, that is just a fundamental principle of fisheries management, to make sure that your fishing pressure is such that you don't compromise the fishing stock for future generations. It's fished at maximum sustainable yield levels or less. In terms of the data and the Commission's fines, the Commission's interest in Strangford Lough is because of the fact that Strangford Lough was declared as a special area of conservation, that it had a number of things within the loch which were of European importance, and that as at a later time those were found not to be in the condition that people hoped they would be in, and that they need to be restored to favourable status. The fisheries data is, there is a monitoring regime in relation to those designated features, which is a responsibility of DOE and monitoring that there. But I'm not sure of your question. I suppose in terms of the absence of fisheries data, what would the Commission do?
Well, I think, Ian, what I'm trying to elicit is how cooperative are those 20 individual fishermen in relation to making authentic returns to you guys?
I think it's too early to say, Joe, to be absolutely...
Well, it is an open question.
Pardon?
It is an open question.
It is. I mean, I think that generally speaking, This fishery is fishing for stock which is not the subject of quota controls, and therefore the Commission would be maybe less interested in that than they would be for some. I mean, I go every December and we come back and tell you how good we've done in getting fishing opportunities. And it's those species that people are very, very interested in terms of how much is landed, how much is taken, how much of your quota is taken. Less so with crab and lobster and other things, but there are obligations under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive to make sure that you demonstrate that your ocean is in good environmental status and your waters are in good environmental status. That means that we have to do more now to understand all of the stocks that are in our waters, not just the ones that are subject to European control. You know, different people will, when you have this voluntary declaration of landings, and we will get better at this because we will have better data about when people fish and where they fish, but when you have this voluntary return, there may be some people who feel that I should say I caught more than I did, or I should say I could caught less than I did for different reasons depending on what their point of view is, or I went fishing more often than I actually did, or I went fishing less often than I actually did. But we depend on the honesty of fishers to a large extent for this information, and some of the stuff that I shared with you earlier is taken from the data that is there. It can be independently corroborated through observation from shore, from fisheries officers who do patrols, but we can't be omnipresent. So you must also accept that there could be some degree of inaccuracy in the data, whether it's intentional or unintentional.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And there's 20 fishermen has received awarded a licence. I see here where it's possible to transfer that licence to another fisherman. What way does that work, that system? Is that?
We haven't worked that one out. You know, for example, I think it was in the letter that I'd sent back to fishermen. If you suppose that the loch can support a certain number of pots, and you have somebody who decides to leave, do you want to actually give everybody else more pots to fish, more days to fish? Depends on the management regime. And these are conversations that we want to have with the management group because we want to understand what they want to see. I think when it's a straightforward case of somebody wanting to leave the business and say sell the boat on to somebody else who wants to continue there, I mean, I really don't see a problem in that. Particularly whenever they're selling on a business to somebody else and maybe it passes from father to son. We need to work out those rules so that they're applied consistently and fairly. But what we don't want to see is a situation where you have open season on Strangford Loch that anybody who decides to come in there and fish can fish, because it is a finite area and obviously the fishing stock can only support a certain amount of fishing effort. And if you have an unsustainable fishery, then it harms the circumstances of everybody. You're not able to make a decent living. The loch can support a certain number of fishermen taking a certain amount of fish, which is going to get a certain income for them. And it has been very stable over the years because the species that they're fishing is very territorial. The fishermen themselves are very territorial. They're probably laying down pots where they've been putting those pots for years and years, and they know that their colleague or their neighbour over there is fishing that part of the loch. So it's a delicate balance which can be easily upset.
Okay, thank you again for giving us the update. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Move on to agenda item 8.
Before we leave that,
go ahead.
I mean, I don't have to tell members that I'm totally dissatisfied with what I heard, but has there been an application from the fishermen themselves to address the committee?
No.
Because that was the last that I had heard from them, that they wanted to address them. So maybe after hearing the presentation today, they will be more anxious to come and address the committee.
Yeah.
Or just see what happens if it comes.
Yeah, so they haven't come forward now to us. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Agenda item 8, written briefing SL1, the Dogs Licensing and Identification Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2014. Can I refer members to the memo from the clerk at page 167 and paper from the department at page 170 onward? Can I advise members that the rule will be made under negative resolution and aims to come into operation on the 1st of January 2015. The legislation is required to be made under the Dogs Northern Ireland Order 1983 and was amended by the Dogs Amendment Act Northern Ireland 2011 to introduce compulsory microchipping. One of the recommendations made by the committee at the time was to consult with councils to assess whether there is a future need for both microchipping and coloured licence tags post-April 2012. The current legislation for a coloured licence tag is renewed in legislation on a 4-year cycle. The current cycle will end on the 31st of December 2014. Following consultation with councils and other stakeholders, 3 options have been identified for consideration in respect of coloured licence tags for dogs. Based on the comments received, the Minister has agreed to option 3, abolish the need for coloured licence tags, with compulsory microchipping to be sole method of ID from the 1st of January 2015. The licence fee was also reviewed as part of the Dogs Amendment Act, Northern Ireland 2011, and there is no overwhelming desire for an immediate review of fees. This will be deferred until 2015. Is there any comments from any members on that issue? Are members content? Okay. Yeah.
Page 13.
Oh, yes. Agenda item 9, correspondence. Can I refer members to the correspondence received at pages 224 to 389, or members content to action correspondence as suggested on the index sheet at page 224?
Chair, can I just raise one issue? It's around the correspondence from the ETI committee regarding the Going for Growth. And I know there is a significant crossover, obviously, between Departments of Agriculture and Enterprise Trade and Investment. And I know there's been quite a bit of discussion here in recent weeks about it. I was just wondering if I'm not proposing it, just maybe for consideration, if there would be an interest maybe in having a joint our committee meeting, maybe with stakeholders and indeed those from Going for Growth, actually maybe in the non-gallery or somewhere, just to hear the views of stakeholders and have those that are leading on the Going for Growth maybe take the views away. It's just a thought, because it's a major issue at the moment and has the potential for big proposals in the future, but just thought it might have been useful to have because I don't know what ETI committee, maybe if we know what they're doing, but it might at least have the conversation, if maybe the staff could have a conversation with the ETI committee staff.
That's okay.
See what they're doing first.
Okay.
But it might be useful if they weren't doing maybe significant work on it. It was to be a joint.
I don't think so.
Okay, Stella? Okay. Can we look at that? Okay. Forward. Can we move on to agenda item 10, forward work programme? Can I refer members to the forward work programme at page 391? Can I advise members that I've asked DART officials to present to the committee on the 18th of November regarding the draft budget for 2015-2016? Can I remind members that, as agreed at the meeting on the 21st of October, next week's meeting will commence at 1 p.m. to facilitate a closed session briefing on the Reservoirs Bill. Can I advise members that the draft DVD legislation briefing has been deferred to later as the session. In the session, as a request at the request of the department, there are problems with the database issue, which has a direct bearing on the commencement date of the order. I also advise members that the list of those being invited to the event in Greenmount College on the 20th of November has been tabled. There are tens of thousands of people who are involved in or benefit from the projects, and it's not possible to invite them all. Staff working with research have made a random selection while making sure there was a wide geographical spread. If any member wishes to ask a specific group or individual, they should let the clerk know as soon as possible. Can I seek agreement for the forward work programme?
Great.
Agenda item 11, any other business? Is there any other business? Any member? Okay. Move on to agenda item 12, date and time of next meeting. Next meeting of the Committee for Agriculture and Rural Development will take place on Tuesday, the 11th of November 2014 at 1 p.m. in room 30, Parliament Buildings. I declare the meeting adjourned.
Now in the Assembly Committee Room.